In 3 weeks' time, the next programme for this course pays a visit to Charing Cross Hospital and explores the electronics associated with electrocardiograms. That's on Saturday, the 27th of May, here on BBC2. Now, a brief look at some of the remaining programmes in today's broadcast for the Open University. In a few moments, there's an examination of the way the BBC handles its coverage of important state rituals. After that, we have an exploration of the problems raised by trying to televise novels with complex narrative structures. That's at 11:25, and then at 10 to 12 we look at one of the direct consequences of special relativity, its effects on time. At 12:15 we consider the work of the Office of Population Censuses and Surveys and discuss the Family Expenditure Survey. And that's followed at 20 to 1 by a look at one of our most threatened landscapes, the wetlands of Norfolk. Well, that's later this morning, but right now we present a programme for the course on the State and Society. Paddy Scannell, Senior Lecturer in Media Studies at the Polytechnic of Central London, continues his examination of the BBC's coverage of great rituals of state and looks at the impact of the introduction of independent television on the BBC.
The following announcement was issued from Buckingham Palace soon after 11:30 this morning.
News relied heavily on official statements. It was reluctant to question the nation's political leaders. The television news interview did not exist.
And First Lord of the Treasury. Sir Anthony Eden accepted Her Majesty's offer and kissed hands upon his appointment. Well, that's the end of the announcement from Buckingham Palace.
News sought to be impartial and accurate, and to avoid controversy and the clash of political opinion. It was cautious and dull. The manner of early television news was consistent with the overall attitude of the BBC at that time to the authority of monarchy, church and state. Overall, it was structured in deference to the ruling power of the state, but this was soon to change. The introduction of commercial television in 1955 destroyed the BBC's monopoly of television and the basis of its unique claim to address the nation as a whole. Competition changed not merely the style of broadcasting, but the social values and attitudes that lay beneath them. Uncritical respect for the authority of the state, the heavy emphasis on its ritualistic, dignified parts, would soon give way to more open examinations of how the nation's rulers actually governed Britain, and of changing attitudes in society at large. Commercial television, with its eyes set on large profits and large audiences, introduced new styles of presentation, more abrasive and populist, less deferential to the powers that be. The contrast between the BBC and ITV can be seen most clearly in their coverage of the state opening of Parliament in 1958. This was the first time that television was allowed to witness this ceremony of state, and Harold Macmillan, the Prime Minister, had stressed that it should be treated as a state event, not a political occasion. BBC cameras covered the ceremony, but ITV was allowed to take a feed from the BBC and to provide their own commentary. Richard Dimbleby was the commentator for the BBC, while Robin Day described the event for ITV. Dimbleby's reputation had been made by his commentary for television on the coronation in 1953. By now he was the voice of the BBC. His manner was reverential, his flow of words measured and dignified. He underlined the symbolic and historic significance of the event, the solemn dignity of the state and its sovereign.
Her Majesty returns the text of the speech to the Lord Chancellor. The Earl Marshal and the Lord Great Chamberlain now come together before Her Majesty to bow to her, to signify that all is in readiness for her procession to return to the robing room whence it came. All rise. As the pages of honor come forward to take Her Majesty's train, sword and cap precede her. Her Majesty bows to both sides of the chamber and turns to Follow Earl Marshal and Lord Great Chamberlain, who still walk backwards before her, out through the doorway. Later today, in the Commons, the debate, and doubtless the argument over the government's programme will begin. But for now, as Her Majesty returns to the robing room and thence to Buckingham Palace, she leaves behind in all of us a memory of a state occasion at its most magnificent, and seen for the first time in our history by millions of people, not only in our own country, but throughout the continent of Europe, from Sicily to Scandinavia.
Robin Day had made his reputation as a news reporter for ITN. He had pioneered a new and aggressive form of television reportage, the probing interview with leading political figures. Some found this fresh and invigorating. Others found it hectoring and bullying. His commentary was in sharp contrast to Dimbleby's, brisk, down to earth, cutting through the pomp and rhetoric of the occasion.
The Lord Chancellor comes to take the speech back from the Queen. And the speech contains no political surprises. Much of it has already been forecast by the statements made by ministers in recent months. Penal reform, help for small farmers, the pension scheme, improvement in treatment for mental health, repeal of the Catering and Wages Act, and educational improvements. Now the Queen prepares to leave. The Earl Marshal and the Lord Great Chamberlain. The Lord Great Chamberlain in charge of the Palace of Westminster, and the Earl Marshal, the Director of Royal Ceremonies. A new session of Parliament has been opened. The Queen will go back to Buckingham Palace. The Crown will go back to the Tower of London. All the scarlet and ermine robes will go back to wherever they came from. And Parliament will go back to work, to pensions, education, unemployment, strikes, Cyprus, disarmament, inflation, and all the rest of it. And the few moments of pageantry in the working life of Parliament are over. Now comes the work, the questions, the arguments, the amendments which will be put down, and the laws which will be made. From this afternoon onwards, both houses will debate the policy set out in the speech from the throne, to which they will all refer with traditional politeness as the gracious speech. As to what the government has put in the gracious speech, comments by the opposition will be far from polite. In the speech today, the government has thrown down the gauntlet, and the opposition will take up the challenge. The party battle will be fought hard and long.
Here's how Richard Dimbleby ended his commentary.
The throne remains rich and shining, near and yet remote, the symbol of this rare meeting of the Queen, the Lords and the Commons, the three estates of Parliament. And so begins, with ceremony that springs from the very roots of our democratic history, the fourth session of the 300th Parliament of the realm.
And these were the closing words of Robin Day.
Everyone is wondering at Westminster what government will write the next speech which the Queen will read from this throne. Before Her Majesty sits on it again, there may be a general election. And that's when we have our say. And what Her Majesty reads from this throne depends on what we put in the ballot box.
It's more than a difference of style. It's a different attitude to politics. Dimbleby, for the BBC, upholds the sacred power and awe of the institutions of state. Day, for ITV, suggests that it's what's happening within the institutions, not their outward formalities, that matters. The focus shifts from the rituals of state to the actions of the state as they affect us. Jonathan Dimbleby has commented, as soon as sceptical people began to wonder what freedom and whose justice the great institutions of state preserved, the portrayal of the state occasion in Richard Dimbleby's way would become an anachronism. By 1958, that time was fast approaching. Between 1950 and 1963, Richard Dimbleby had covered more than 150 royal, state, or national ceremonies for the BBC. But by the early 1960s, such programs were in decline. At that time, the volume of news, current affairs, and topical magazine programs increased sharply. So too did documentaries and plays that sought to examine the political and social issues of the day. Broadcasting was for the first time becoming politicized. Within the limits of parliamentary democracy, within the obligations of impartiality and balance imposed by the state, television now turned a sharper and more critical eye on politicians, parties and governments.
This is BBC Television.
Led by Hugh Green, who became Director General in 1959, the BBC dedicated itself not only to winning back the audience it had lost to ITV, but to actively engaging with the changing social, moral and political attitudes of the 60s. To some, it seemed as if all the traditional values they had cherished, and which the BBC had always upheld, were now being stood on their heads.
On Tuesday, the Queen will make her annual speech, a speech which will be broadcast on radio and television throughout the world, a speech which yet somehow manages to be essentially personal. What a blessing it is that in this message, at least, she can get through to us directly, and not through the thick fog thrown up by church and state, by Archbishop and Prime Minister, by doctrine and policy. How dreadful it would be if her fireside chat was altered and amended like the cold official statements at the opening of Parliament.
Now, let us spare a thought for all those people who will not today be enjoying a good Christmas dinner like you and me. But not to excess, I think, yes. My own family is increasing in size, and I would like to congratulate the Princess Margaret for giving birth to Viscount Linley. Here, 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 here.
The coming year will be one of endeavour, and we like to think, and we are certain success. Foremost among our problems is you must elect a new government for me. Yes, that's all right. I hope that you will choose wisely and well. Democracy and the monarchy and the established church are indissoluble parts of our divine heritage, of our island heritage. Winston will like that, nobody else likes it.
While the satire of That Was the Week That Was may seem dated now, it delighted many in 1963 and seemed like a breath of fresh air. But many other viewers were deeply offended to see religious or political authority mocked and jeered at. And it wasn't just in late-night satire programs.
In plays, serious discussion programs, investigations with the lid off, conventional morality is repeatedly sneered at. Religion is mocked, the police are vilified, criminals are treated with almost loving pity. In this extraordinary climate, how can smuttiness fail to flourish? It marches with the times. It is frank, fearless, progressive.
Progressive television was felt to threaten the traditional values of society at both ends. Firstly, it seemed to attack the forces of morality, religion, law and order. It questioned, criticized or mocked the nation's political leaders. It seemed to undermine the political authority of the nation's legitimate representatives and guardians. At the same time, it undermined the private authority of the family and the integrity of home life. Violence, bad language and sexual promiscuity seemed to have invaded the programs. Television was no longer safe to watch.
You say that the rot started in the 60s. And right at the beginning of your book, you seem to suggest that the arch-villain of the piece was the then Director General, Sir Hugh Carlton Green.
That's right. Well, he was, in the first instance, and this was why he had so much power, responsible for, as the BBC's own handbook said, television, the most powerful medium ever to affect the thinking and behaviour of people.
Mrs. Mary Whitehouse, a school teacher and mother, was increasingly disturbed by the harmful effects of television.
Was not only to open the door to new ideas and new concepts with which I would have been wholly in support so long as it was done responsibly, but he also closed the doors to the many voices who could have given the counterbalance to those new ideas. So what happened in effect was that the established values, I'm not saying static, I'm not interested in a static society, but I think you have to have a stable society, because without that you can't make progress. Now, by wholly, as it were, mounting or allowing to be mounted, a wholesale attack on the established values which would give the foundation upon which new ideas could have been drawn in, he attacked those and gave a wide open door.
In 1964, she wrote, Men, women and children listen and view at the risk of serious damage to their morality, patriotism, their discipline, and their family life. In the same year, she founded the National Viewers and Listeners Association, dedicated to cleaning up television. If there was one single programme that affronted what Mrs. Whitehouse believed in, it was perhaps the BBC comedy series Till Death Us Do Part.
Yeah, well, you was on about them being a Jewish team.
Well, so they are. That's why they don't like playing on Saturday, innit? Saturday is your Jews' Sabbath, innit? And that's why your Spurs have never done much, have they? See, they're too inhibited out there on a Saturday afternoon. I mean, they're frightened of incurring the wrath of their God, you see. They sort of play on Sunday afternoon, but your Christian teams, like Millwall, West End, they won't play with them, because Sunday is their Sabbath, innit? Same with your Jewish television. Hey, look, on your Christian BBC, see,
yeah,
they have your match of the day on Saturday night, right?
Right.
But on your Jewish television, on your I'm laughing, listen, on your Saberna Delafonte Solly Bernstein television, they have to have their match of the day on Sunday afternoon, see?
Because they have a rabbi introducing them too.
They do. Jimmy Hill.
Garnett has been called a howling embodiment of all the most vulgar and odious prejudices that slop about in the bilges of the national mind. He's a foul-mouthed bigot and racist, and Mrs. Whitehouse has protested against the offensiveness of his language and his racist views. Yet Garnett is also a Tory, a patriot who believes in God and is devoted to the royal family. He respects many of the values held by Mrs. Whitehouse and her followers, and which she believes are undermined by television. Though Till Death is about a traditional East End working-class family, at another level it can be seen as a biting parody of the conservative religious and political loyalties of the traditional middle-class English family. Mrs. Whitehouse recognises this paradox, for, as she said, if we could be made to hate Garnett's offensiveness and prejudices, we could also perhaps turn against his loyalties. What is intolerable is that love of country and monarchy, respect for religious and political authority, should appear in the mouth of a monster like Alf. In the 60s, broadcasting seemed to desert its public service values, especially the BBC. For years, it had upheld respect for the nation's religious and political institutions and for the privacy and standards of family life. Now it threatened both. Protests against the dangerous power of broadcasting came from many conflicting quarters, from politicians and parties who felt the broadcasters were becoming over-mighty subjects, from critics on the left who argued that television, for all its innovations, still worked to maintain the status quo, and from articulate members of the middle class who felt their home-centred way of life was under attack. The growing volume of criticism posed a real problem for the BBC. In 1968, a paper on broadcasting and the public mood by the Board of Governors declared,
"The BBC operates today within a society which is uncertain, contradictory and divided. There has been a series of financial crises, unemployment and redeployment of painful social phenomena. Events in Vietnam and the United States have caused dilemmas of sentiment and principle. Immigration on our own doorstep has proved the latest confrontation with unwelcome realities. Nationalism, separatism and factionalism could be added to the list. So could the sharpness of domestic political divisions. A country divided and disturbed inevitably has the BBC on the rack. There are no guaranteed remedies to the discomforts of the BBC's role as national scapegoat. A cool nerve is needed, alike by its governors and staff. The BBC has at once to be alert and deaf, to listen to silence as well as to clamour, to have a skin thick and sensitive, to step boldly and delicately."
Since then, you might think the BBC has opted more and more to step delicately rather than boldly. The Annan Report in 1976 recorded its distinct impression that all was not well inside the corporation. In particular, its news and current affairs programmes were less adventurous and interesting than those of ITV. But the report did emphasise that the BBC was still arguably the single most important cultural institution in the nation, and that it should continue to be the national instrument of broadcasting in the United Kingdom. What it meant by this became clearer when the report resisted the suggestion made by some of its members that the BBC should be split in two. To do so would maim an institution which the nation at large, on some great national occasion, regards as the natural interpreter of that event to the nation as a whole. So the popularity of most members of the House of Windsor continues to be upheld by television saturation coverage of jubilees, birthdays, weddings and royal tours abroad.
And they have their wish.
The chairman of the BBC Governors have told the Annan Committee
An enormous amount of the BBC work is, in fact, social cement of one kind or another. Royal occasions, religious services, sports coverage and police series all reinforce the sense of belonging to our country, being involved in its celebrations and sharing what it stands for.
the report itself tartly commented,
It must be admitted that an irate supporter of the virtue of being British is unlikely to take kindly to the argument that a stirring police series in which the villains each week regularly get their comeuppance adequately balances a politically committed documentary drama denouncing the corruption of politicians, trades unionists, company directors and social workers who are all portrayed as part of a vast conspiracy to defraud and stamp on the poor.
But governments can manipulate idioms of national identity and stage manage rituals and ceremonies to celebrate its victories after the event. None of us was allowed to see much of what was actually happening during the Falklands War, but we were all invited to the service of Thanksgiving and victory parades. During the war, the BBC took a cool approach to the conflict. It deliberately distanced itself from the surge of national pride whipped up in sections of the popular press. A panorama programme about opposition in Britain to the war drew a storm of protest. Outrage over the BBC, shouted the Sun. Storm at Panorama's despicable RG bias. Mrs. Whitehouse issued a statement calling it arrogant and disloyal. It was fiercely attacked by Conservatives in the Commons next day, when the Prime Minister expressed her hope that the British people would make their views directly known to the BBC through their letters and telephone calls. The BBC strongly defended itself and, after the war, accused the government of manipulating news and information during the conflict. Still, television was there to represent the celebrations afterwards, and the Prime Minister's claim that we had at last put the word great back into Britain. Nigel Lawson, a member of Mrs. Thatcher's government, declared after the Falklands,
The long years of retreat and self-doubt are over. A new self-respect, a new self-confidence, a new sense of pride in ourselves has been reborn. It is the rebirth of Britain.
Broadcasting in Britain was set up by the state in the national interest, and the BBC developed as an institution committed to keeping the United Kingdom united. We have seen that, while it enjoyed a monopoly of broadcasting before and after the war, the corporation was supportive of the British state and its institutions. In the late 50s and for most of the 60s, it seemed to be going the other way in the eyes of many people. In the 70s and 80s, it has tried to retrieve a middle ground between tradition and change, and to avoid antagonizing unduly its political masters and the viewing public. In a divided society, the task of broadcasting becomes more controversial and contradictory. Negotiating the thresholds of tolerance on political, social and moral issues becomes an increasingly delicate task. National broadcasting systems work to maintain social continuity while adjusting to and representing the forces of social change. Though respect for political authority may have been eroded in the last 25 years, popular affection and loyalty to the monarchy, the most effective symbol of the unity of the nation as family, remains as potent today as it was in the time of Walter Bagehot. And national television continues to capture those moments of community and social solidarity for all of us.
T283 Society.
Another programme for this course will discuss the conflict of interest between the freedom of the press and the national interest. That's in 3 weeks' time on Saturday the 27th of May here on 2. And before then there's a discussion about democracy in practice, and you can listen to it next Sunday the 14th of May at 25 to 7 in the morning on Radio 3 FM. In 25 minutes we explore what happens to time when you get near to the speed of light. Right now, here's the Arts Faculty's third-level course, the 19th Century Novel and Its Legacy, looking at television adaptations of 3 novels.